All right, well, tonight we would like to welcome Amanda Shave. Amanda has a master's degree from the Avian Behavior and Conservation Lab at the University of Manitoba, where she studied the impacts of climate change on purple martin reproduction. She has experience assessing the health of riparian ecosystems and as an environmental policy analyst. And currently she's the Important Bird Area and Manitoba Chimney Swift Initiative Coordinator for Nature Manitoba. So I know I'm really excited to learn about the Prairie Birds of Manitoba. So without further ado, I will go ahead and let Amanda take over, and you can share your screen when you're ready.
Thank you. Just give me a minute here to set that up. Okay, I think we're good to go here. Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Amanda, and I'm the coordinator for two programs at Nature Manitoba, but I'm presenting tonight on behalf of our Manitoba Important Bird Areas program, looking at Prairie Birds of Manitoba. So I'll be referencing important bird areas a couple times near the end of the presentation. So I thought I'd just sort of get what we are out there off the bat. So Important Bird Areas is a program that is international, started by BirdLife, the BirdLife program. And there are IBAs worldwide, across Canada, and of course in Manitoba. And they're areas that are identified as important for large congregations of birds or for bird species at risk. So we have 36 across the province, 11% in coastal tundra habitat, 38% in southern boreal, and 28% in the parkland farmland habitat. And that's where the grassland bird habitat falls. As a program, we hold webinars and presentations, and we run citizen science events such as bird blitzes, shoreline cleanups, and habitat restorations projects. So when I'm looking at grassland birds, I'm looking at them from sort of a monitoring and outreach perspective in terms of which birds I'm going to be presenting today. So this is a prairie organization, so perhaps this is a bit redundant, but in terms of history of the prairie, grasslands were historically maintained through patterns of disturbance and nutrient input, things like grazing and pooping of bison, and fire cycle disturbances across the landscape. And this created a mosaic of habitat through areas with greater nutrient input, had more grass or perhaps taller grass. Areas of disturbance had shorter grass or maybe bare ground. So this mosaic across the landscape has been really important for not only prairie grassland birds, but for a variety of grassland species in general. And then of course, with European settlement across North America, this vastly changed our grassland habitat, both in terms of how we manage it, grassland conversion, taking a large majority of bison off the landscape, etc. So as I just mentioned, we've got threats to grassland now, suppression of fire cycles, which removes one of those disturbance factors. We've got the removal of bison or large herbivores from the landscape, which changes that nutrient input, as well as grazing as a disturbance. We also have the creation of linear disturbances, so things like roads, power lines, railways, etc. And of course, the big one is the conversion of grassland to other land use types. So whether that be to monoculture cropland or to cities, etc. So the majority of remaining prairie in Manitoba occurs on private land. And we've found working with outreach for prairie birds that cattle producers are important stewards of grassland landscape. Unfortunately, while we wish that everybody would see the intrinsic value of grassland landscape, that's not always the case. Sometimes we need to put an economic value on that. And with working with cattle producers, we're able to show an economic value of the land that they're using for grazing their cattle. As well, a lot of cattle producers have a really deep connection to the land. Often it's been in their family for generations, and it's critical to their livelihood. So we have found outreach and working with cattle producers to be a way to spread the message of the importance of grassland birds in the habitats where they occur. And as well, responsible grazing can create a mosaic of habitat that's important for breeding grassland birds to try and replicate to some extent how bison and other grazing animals would interact with grasslands in the past. So why are grassland birds so important? Why are people so interested in them? And how have these threats changed distributions of grassland birds? Sort of to put it bluntly, we've seen great decreases in grassland birds since 1970. So this is a graph from the State of Canada's Birds Report in 2019. And they've found that our grasslands have lost 300 million birds since 1970, and that's 2 out of every 3 birds that existed at that point. So you can see the rate of change varies depending on sort of which way you group the birds. So a decline of 39% for species that are tolerant of agriculture, but all the way to a decline of 87% for species dependent on native grasslands. So because of this decline, Manitoba has many grassland species that are considered at risk, both under federal and provincial acts. So going from least to greatest severity of population decline, we have species that are not at risk, and then we've got species that are special concern, species that are threatened, species that are endangered, and species that are extirpated. So in terms of species that are extirpated, those are species where they're not extinct, but they're gone from a specific portion of their range. So a Manitoba example for that is the bird up in the top corner, which is the greater prairie chicken. So this bird has been extirpated from southern Manitoba, where part of its original range. It was in both the tall and mixed grass prairie habitats, which we'll go into in a second, but it became extirpated in the 1950s. But it can still be found in North Dakota and Minnesota in small numbers. So every once in a while, people get excited that maybe it will have made its way back, but numbers are declining in those regions as well. So unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen. So I just mentioned types of prairies, so I'll just briefly go over it because the types of birds you're going to see will depend on the type of prairie habitat you're looking at. So first we've got the tall grass prairie, which is characterized by having a high annual rainfall and cooler temperatures. And this is the prairie where less than 1% of its habitat remains in Manitoba. So you can see remnants at Okamic Marsh, of course, at Living Prairie Museum. And then there's the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve down in southeastern Manitoba. The tallgrass prairie, perhaps because we have such small remnants left, but also historically just has fewer bird species that use it. And the second type of prairie we have in Manitoba is the mixed grass prairie. So the mixed grass prairie is characterized by having medium annual rainfall and moderate temperatures. We do have a little bit more of our mixed grass prairie left in Manitoba, about 10% of the historic extent of it. The prairie we do have is generally in western Manitoba, sort of central western to southwestern Manitoba. There's a strip along the border there with Saskatchewan. The short and tall grass creates a matrix of habitats that support a number of different bird species, including some endemic species, which I'll get into in a minute. It's also helpful that because we have a little bit more of our mixed grass prairie left, we do have some areas where there are larger extensive prairie, which helps support certain grassland birds. So I recognize some names in the webinar, but I'm not sure how much birding background everyone here has. So I thought I'd just quickly go over some bird identification basics. So some of the things we look at when we're identifying a bird include size and shape. So if you close your eyes and you think of sort of the silhouette of, for example, this bird in the picture, the black-capped chickadee. We're also looking for color and pattern, of course. Behavior can be helpful in certain species. For habitat, we're largely looking at grassland habitats, so that'll be similar for most of our birds here. And then there's also sound, and I'm not going to get too much into sound today because that could be a totally different webinar, but I'll play sounds for some birds where that part is key in identification. Other things that can be useful to have is, of course, binoculars if you want to see the birds up close, and a field guide of some sort to help you identify. So whether that be, there's birding apps now that it can be very useful. Some people prefer field guides. I've got an example picture here on the screen, but there's lots of different types of field guides that you could choose. So with that, we'll go into our first category of prairie birds, and that is our primary prairie and endemic species. So primary prairie species are species that spend the majority or most of their life cycle in grassland habitat. And a lot of our primary prairie species are endemic species, where it's a species that only exists in a single defined range. So these two factors overlap in a lot of our primary prairie species. So the first one I have here is a Sprague's pipit. Looking at it sort of at first glance, you might think, hey, that looks like a sparrow. And it's a bit deceiving in a photo because you can't really see the size, but it's a little bit bigger than a sparrow. They're actually in a different family. The family is called Motacillidae, and there's not very many birds in this family. But if you're taking a first glance at it and you're thinking it looks kind of like a sparrow, you can look at, it's got a small head with a relatively large eye, which is different. It has a longer, pointier beak than a sparrow would have. And as well, it's got longer legs, sort of the leg to body ratio. So that would tell you that it's something different than a sparrow. Other characteristics, like I said, that large eye, that's pretty different from most birds. It's got a streaked back, and if it was to turn towards you, you'd see a necklace of streaks on the breast. If it was in flight, you would see extensive white sides on the tail. When it's at rest, the way the tail feathers stack, those white sides slide underneath, and the middle feathers are actually on top, so you can't see it at rest. And this is a bird where hopefully my sound will work. I'll try to play it in a second, but it's often heard before it's seen. So this is a bird that some people call the soundtrack of the grasslands. When it's defending its territory or declaring its territory, the males will fly way up high in the sky, and they'll be up there for anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours, just flying and singing this song. So we'll see if it works. So hopefully you were able to hear that. If not, if you just type that in and type in Sprague's pipit and song, you'll be able to hear it. There's lots of recordings because it is such a unique feature of this bird. Sprague's pipits are threatened both federally and provincially. And part of that reason is because they need really large areas of habitat to successfully breed. So they really need open, expansive mixed grass prairie. And in areas with limited native prairie, they can use tame pastures and haylands, but it's not preferred. So each species I talk about, I'll have a map that looks like this. And this is from the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas that was done a number of years ago. And they produce these maps that are probability of occurrence maps. So basically, it's taking you from a low probability of occurrence in the beige. So you're probably unlikely to see the bird in that area. And it goes all the way up to the dark green, where it's highly likely that that bird is occurring. So you probably have a good chance of seeing it. So in this case, you can see that there is a band of green that goes up from the southwest corner all the way up to near Russell. So that's sort of following that band of mixed grass prairie that's available. And you can see that goes a little bit, extends into Oak Lake kind of area near Glenborough. So because they require these large continuous areas of mixed grass prairie, their range largely follows that in Manitoba. So next we have a very charismatic bird. This is the chestnut colored longspur, a little bit smaller than the Sprague's pipit. And the males, in this species, the male and the female look quite a bit different. Once again, the female looks kind of sparrow-like, but in a different family than the sparrow. The male has a rufous neck, which is another word for reddish brown that birders love to use. I don't know, it's always rufous, but we've got a rufous back of the neck, a creamy front of the neck, and you can't see in this picture, but they have a black belly. The males are much easier to see. The color stands out a lot more, and they are going to be singing more loudly, sitting up high, defending their territory. As I said, the females look more sparrow-like. They have a broad, pale eyebrow of feathers above their eye. They have a very plain face, an unstreaked breast, and a white belly. And this is another species that is threatened both federally and provincially. In terms of where to spot chestnut-colored longspur, you can see that their map, if you look at the beige, kind of follows that same line up the southwestern side of Manitoba, but they're really quite concentrated right in the southwest. The chestnut-colored longspur really likes well-grazed pastures and short, dry grasslands. So this is a bird where if you had mixed grass prairie just kind of sitting there, nothing was happening on it, the grass would likely get too tall, and then we would have shrubs and other woody vegetation moving in, and that would render the habitat not suitable for chestnut-colored longspurs. However, if you've got, for example, cattle grazing on the grassland, you can keep certain areas short, and that will help keep that habitat suitable for chestnut-colored longspurs. Interestingly for this species, that prior to the 1980s, it could be found all the way east to Winnipeg and up into the southern Interlake. And the range has, as you can obviously see, greatly contracted, and this is both due to weather patterns as well as loss of grassland, which has put them sort of back in the southwest corner. So next, we do have an actual sparrow species, about the same size as the chestnut-colored longspur, a little bit smaller. You can see overall a very streaky appearance. They have well, they're obviously streaked on the back, but if you look at them from the front, like the bottom picture, they have a narrow breast band of streaking before it goes into a plain white belly. They also overall have a buffy colored head and nape, and they have a weak eye line that sometimes people describe as having the Nike swoosh or the Nike check mark. I don't usually see that personally, but that is a characteristic that some people use to be able to identify this bird. The Baird sparrow is very camouflaged, so it's another one that you're probably going to hear rather than see. So I do have the sound here, and hopefully once again, you guys are able to hear that.
So Amanda, I think you have to enable the sound to be shared from your computer through your app. So it's possible you may have to stop sharing and then enable that, but it depends on how many sounds you still have to play with. So
I think this was the last one, so okay, we'll maybe just keep that. But yeah, if you want to, once again, that'll be something that you can find quite easily if you're interested in looking at that or hearing that, I suppose. So where to spot Baird sparrow? Unlike the chestnut-colored longspur, the Baird sparrow likes ungrazed to moderately grazed native pasture but still with minimal shrub cover, or they can also use areas of denser vegetation in well-grazed areas. So this is a species that can really take advantage of the mosaic across of disturbance across grasslands. So if you've got areas where cattle are grazing, maybe there's some vegetation that's less palatable to them, and that's where Baird sparrow can hang out within pasture that is more grazed. You can also sometimes find them in tame grasslands, haylands, and alfalfa fields. And similar to the pattern for chestnut-colored longspurs, you can see they're largely right in southwestern Manitoba. And I don't think I've said yet sort of what towns are down there if you're trying to look at where they are. This will largely be in the area of Lyleton, Pearson, Coulter, what else is over there? Broomhill. So small towns right in the corner, even further southwest than Melita. So next we have a raptor. This is the Frunginus hawk, much bigger than anything we've looked at so far, 1.6 kilograms. I've got pictures here of both a shot of it going overhead as well as a shot side on. You're probably way more likely to see them soaring overhead. So that's probably the photo I would use for identification purposes. But they do have a large heavy bill, which you can see in the side on photo. But the quick diagnostic for Ferruginous hawk is the dark feathering on the legs and how that forms a V shape in flight. So you can see it has a mostly white chest, but then as the legs come out of the body and join together, well, not join together, but are held sort of together as they're flying, you can see that it forms the V shape. Ferruginous hawks are considered endangered provincially and threatened sort of across Canada. And they are an interesting species as the majority of their diet is made up of Richardson's ground squirrels. So this can be a helpful species to farmers as large ground squirrel colonies can cause trouble with herds of cattle and just generally make things a little bit more difficult if you're trying to avoid stepping in holes. But that is prime habitat for these guys. Ferruginous hawks were uncommon but regular sort of species prior to European settlement. They all but disappeared in the 1920s and then sort of recolonized the Southwest in the 1980s. Around that time, we had about 55 nesting pairs, but then their populations have declined since then. So to try to help populations, the province and partners have actually put up artificial nests throughout their sort of breeding range in southwestern Manitoba. So I have a picture of it here. This one picture is from Alberta, but our setup is similar. Their sort of natural nesting habitat would sort of be the lone trees here and there in the prairie, where they have a good view out around them, but they're raised up from the ground. This is another species like Sprague's pipits that need the expansive undisturbed grasslands. They really need quite a large area to be able to hunt successfully. So next we have always a favorite, the burrowing owl. I've got photos here of a juvenile on the left and an adult on the right. Burrowing owls are a pretty small owl. 155 grams is sort of an average size. You can see that the young and the adults look a little bit different. We've got a white throat on the adults. Both the young and the adults have white eyebrows or sort of a white mask. I think it sometimes makes the adults look a little bit angry, but definitely cute angry though. The adults also have broad barring on their underside, and they all have long legs. And the burrowing owl is actually excellent at catching prey while running on the ground, which would really be helpful for those long legs. They don't have any kind of adaptation for burrowing as they don't make their own burrows. Instead, they use burrows that have been abandoned by species like badgers or ground squirrels that they're then able to use. They are an endangered species, both provincially and federally. So burrowing owls are another species that like areas with short or sparse vegetation, such as moderately or heavily grazed prairie. However, they do often forage in nearby areas with taller vegetation. So having that mosaic of grassland, grass heights, and coming from, like I said, disturbance or nutrient inputs is really important for them. This map is a little bit different than the other ones. This is a breeding occurrence map, but similar idea, squares of orange is possible breeding. It goes all the way up to confirmed breeding. So you can see most of the sites, once again, are right in southwestern Manitoba. We've got one a little bit to the east of Oak Lake. That's a little bit further out. But generally, if burrowing owls are found, it's usually kept quite quiet. They are a very photogenic species, but they're also an endangered species. So the locations are generally not given out, and we try to keep it quiet if people in the birding community do hear about it, to give them the best chance we can. at successfully being able to raise young. There is a program called the Manitoba Burrowing Owl Recovery Program, MBORP is their acronym, and they work to increase population numbers through breeding captive release birds and monitoring nests of wild burrowing owls as well. So that's a photo of them doing their work in the bottom corner. So that was our primary prairie species. Now I've got a selection of secondary prairie species to look at. So these are birds which spend only a proportion of their life cycle in grasslands or only a small portion of their ranges in grasslands. So when we're going through these species, you'll see the range maps are quite a bit bigger for some of them. And you may say, hey, I've seen that bird in habitat that's not grassland. So there is these species are generally more adaptable to a wider range of habitats. But I'm certainly by no means going to go through all the secondary prairie species. There are many more species that can exist in grassland habitats as well that we don't have time for today. So the first species is the loggerhead shrike. So the loggerhead shrike is actually a songbird, but it is our only predatory songbird. So you might be able to tell by that hooked bill, which a lot of hawks and other raptors have. And that hooked bill is made for tearing, so for tearing flesh. So these guys will go after things like small mammals, larger insects like grasshoppers, and they are known as the butcher bird, is sort of a colloquial name for them. And they are known also for then impaling their prey on either barbed wires or thorns, such as from hawthorn bushes, to, I guess, kind of for storage and for being able to hold it steady while they eat. So this is a very unique bird. We have two species of shrike in Manitoba. The northern shrike is the one that we would see, for example, in and around Winnipeg, usually. Then we have the loggerhead shrike, which is seen more in southwestern Manitoba. So they're pretty big, and they have a broad dark mask that runs from their beak back to behind their eye. They have a fairly stubby bill, and they are a darker gray on the back. So compared to the northern shrike, these guys have the broader mask, they have a stubbier bill, and they're darker gray. They're threatened federally and endangered in Manitoba. So loggerhead shrike have open habitat characterized by low grasses, mixed with a combination of bare ground and shrubs or short trees. So they really like having that variety in their habitat. Most nest in scattered trees or shrubs with open area. And as I said, they require something sort of sharp and pointy, whether that be a barbed wire fence or thorny vegetation nearby that they use for their prey. And if you ever see something impaled on a fence or on a thorn, a small mammal or something like that, then there's probably a shrike of some sort nearby. So as you can see from the map here, there is still a concentration in southwestern Manitoba, although they're more sort of dispersed. And I don't know how well you guys can see, but there is the light beige line sort of going a little bit further east in near the Glenborough label on the map. So they are a little bit more widespread. Oh, I was also going to touch on, at one point, we actually had a small population of loggerhead shrikes near Winnipeg, but I don't think they have been seen since around 2009. So it's been a while, but we did have a small group of them near the city. Next, we have the bobolink. So this is a very distinct bird, both by sight and by sound. I don't have the sound for this, so we don't have to worry about that. But they sound like R2-D2 from Star Wars. So very unique, very different than anything else you'll hear while you're out walking and birding. It's a very electronic kind of sound. They are a fairly large bird, 43 grams, and the male and female look different in this species. So the male will have the black underside, cream-colored nape on the back of the neck, and also white down the back, which you can see from the photo in the bottom corner. The females, once again, look kind of sparrow-like. They have a pale nape, pale lores, which is the area in between the beak and the eye, and a large pinkish beak. So that robust beak gives you a good characteristic that you're not looking at a sparrow, you're looking at something else. And then if you look at the other features, you'll eventually come to bobolink. Both males and females have a short pointed tail, and these are this is a threatened species in Canada. So here you can really see the sort of secondary prairie species nature of the bobolink. The range map, or the probability of occurrence map, is greatly expanded, especially compared to the primary prairie species we were looking at. So these guys can use a variety of grassland habitats, including native grasslands, pastures, hayfields, wet meadows where vegetation is pretty tall. They can use alfalfa fields in Manitoba. And because they live in habitats generally where grasses are a little bit taller, you often see males perching on high points in fields, whether that be a shrub or a tall stalk of grass to sing. Next, we have the grasshopper sparrow. So we've got a couple of sparrows to look at here, and these are actually sparrows. So the grasshopper sparrow, quite small, 17 grams. Overall, a generally buffy color. So whether that be the head, the breast, the back. The back is also patterned with rufous, which is that reddish brown color, black and gray. And you can see a bit of that in this picture. Grasshopper sparrow has a complete white eye ring of feathers. Unfortunately, that's not super clear in this photo, but basically, just as it sounds, a white ring of feathers around the eye. They have a large bill for the sparrows. They also have an orange-yellow lore, which is that area between the bill and the eye, which you can see in the photo here, as well as yellow on the leading edge of the wing, which also shows up in this photo. The grasshopper sparrow is another bird that you often hear before seeing it, just because like some of the other sparrows, like the Baird sparrow, they're quite camouflaged with the surroundings. So grasshopper sparrows occur in large, dense, idle hay fields and hay fields, as well as in denser vegetation and moderately grazed pasture lands. So this is another species that likes the grass to be a little bit longer, or likes the longer grass in the mosaic of grasslands. They generally prefer open grasslands rather than ones that would have shrubs or woody vegetation. And you can see from their range map, they form sort of a wedge shape out from the southwest corner. You can find them as sort of far into central Manitoba as Brandon, and in some places the Assiniboine River, but they're definitely more concentrated on the prairie in southwestern Manitoba. Grasshopper sparrows are an interesting species because they did actually temporarily increase their abundance, so the number of sparrows, as well as their sort of range or distribution in Manitoba during the major droughts we had in the late 1980s. So as things dried up in areas where habitat was marginal, so for example, maybe it was prairie wetland, as that dried out, it became an opportunity for grassland sparrows, which are more of a prairie species, to move in, and they're able to take advantage of that marginal habitat that got better for them during the drought. Our next species is the clay-colored sparrow, so another sparrow here. Smaller than the grasshopper sparrow at 12 grams. They actually have quite a distinct face mask of brown bordered by white, and they also have a pale, what we would call mustache. So you can see coming from more the top of the bill, we've got dark brown on the top of the head, and then a pattern of white, and then a lighter brown spot over what we would think of as maybe the ear, and then the mustache that comes out from the bottom of the bill is that white stripe. A great feature to distinguish clay-colored sparrows, because they are the only sparrows that have this, is a gray collar on the nape. So sometimes people will mistakenly call them clay collared sparrow instead of clay colored sparrow. But that gray is quite distinctive, and it's only found on this species. Compared to some of the other sparrows we've looked at, they have a completely unstreaked breast, and they also have a long notched tail. So this is another species that, while they are able to use grassland, they also use a variety of other habitats, as you can see reflected on the map here. They like areas with scattered low shrubs, such as grassland edges or aspen parkland meadows. So that gives them the ability to really spread out in Manitoba. They generally avoid cropland, like monoculture cropland, but they will use hay or alfalfa fields. And like some of the other species we've discussed, they're often seen singing on tall vegetation or shrubs. And if you don't see them, they have a song that sounds quite a bit like an insect. It's a repeated buzz sound. So if you hear that, it might not necessarily be an insect. It could also be a clay-colored sparrow. So now we're switching gears out of the sparrows, and we are looking at the very charismatic Western meadowlark. Western meadowlark is quite a large bird. They've got quite a rounded body, and their sort of head profile going to their beak is also quite distinctive. So if we talked about sort of body shape and silhouette as an identification feature for birds, it works really well with Western meadowlarks because there's nothing else that really looks, has the same profile as them. So that round body and the fairly flat profile going from head into that really sharp, large beak. Of course, they're also a pretty characteristic color with that bright yellow throat and breast and the black necklace. And also, if you see these guys in flight, the tail has white outer feathers that would come up. We do have eastern meadowlarks occasionally in Manitoba, but they're much less common. So if you're seeing a meadowlark, it's probably a western meadowlark. In terms of where to spot these guys, their presence on the landscape generally follows areas of grassland and farmland. So you can see that the probability of observing these guys really dies out in areas where we have boreal forest, both in eastern Manitoba, as well as going sort of up in the northern interlake. They prefer native prairie and or lightly grazed pasture and hayland over monoculture cropland. However, you can still find them in these areas, as sometimes habitat along roadsides provides enough habitat for them to be successful. You can see them both on the ground or singing from fence posts is quite a common sort of position for them. And they have a really lovely musical song that they sing. So next we have the horned lark. So quite a bit smaller than our western meadowlark. And you might think, because they're called horned lark, the horns are going to be the key feature for these guys. That is unfortunately not true. This is a bird that has kind of a tricky name. They do have horns of feathers that they can raise, like the individual in the bottom photo here. But you're not always going to see that. More often the feathers are not raised. So as a better identification feature would be the black mustache. Once again, sort of the feathers coming from the base of the beak and heading down towards the neck, as well as that black triangle in their throat and the yellow throat itself. As well, when they're in flight, they have a dark tail with pale middle feathers and also a narrow white edge. And you can see the narrow white edge on the tail a little bit on the horned lark that's sitting on the rock there. So where to spot the horned lark? They're found in areas with bare or sparsely vegetated ground, so they really don't like much ground cover at all. The reason for the bare ground doesn't really matter to the larks. It can be bare because it's heavily grazed. It can be bare because it was maybe it's like a fallow field that was cultivated, or it can be areas that were naturally sparse. For example, really sandy soils that maybe vegetation has trouble growing. Horned larks are quite early to come back in the spring, so sometimes you'll see them on roadways before even all of our snow has melted. You can see that their distribution is generally all across southern Manitoba. Next, we've got another raptor, the Swainson's hawk. Swainson's hawks are a little bit smaller than the Ferruginous hawks we talked about earlier. Once again, I tried to get an under the bird shot and a side on shot here. So a couple key features for them being in the air is that they have quite long wings compared to their body size, and the wing tips are quite pointed, as opposed to some other species, it'll be more rounded. As well, the leading edge or the front edge of their wings will be light colored, and the trailing edge or the back edge of their wings will be dark colored. Most of the Swainson's hawks I've seen in Manitoba are a light morph. So they have a light body and they'll have sort of chestnut colored upper breast. But there are dark morphs of Swainson's hawk where the entire sort of body and chest is a dark rufous color, but it will still have a light leading edge to the wing and a dark trailing edge to the wing. So that's something that stays consistent, as well as the sort of shape, the pointed shape to the wing will also stay consistent between color morphs. In terms of where to look for Swainson's hawk, we look for them in native prairie, of course, pastures, sparse shrublands, and small areas of open woodland. So they definitely have a wider habitat they can use than Ferruginous hawks. They have adapted to be able to feed in agricultural areas, but generally it has to be areas with sort of shorter crops that would be sort of the size of that the grassland would grow to. So for example, a field of corn would not be helpful for these guys. The population of Swainson's hawks greatly declined after European settlement in the prairies, for similar reason with the Ferruginous hawks, with the loss of grassland. And these guys also like ground squirrels, so fewer prey available for them to eat. While they do have quite a big probability of distribution here where you can see them, a lot of it is that sort of light colored that suggests you're probably not going to see them all that often. And that's because 40% of the population is in the prairie pothole region. There is a separate disjunct population of Swainson's hawks in Winnipeg. I know that I always used to see a group of them along Bishop Grandin as I was heading off to university a couple of years ago, or heading to the U of M along Bishop Grandin. So yeah, there is a sort of a separate population within Winnipeg, and the majority of them are sort of towards southwestern Manitoba. Next, we've got a beautiful owl, the short-eared owl. These guys are a little bit bigger than the burrowing owls, and they look quite striking. They have a round head with a white face and dark eye patches. It looks a little bit like they have makeup on. They've got a heavily barred body or heavily streaked body and barred wingtips that are visible when they're in flight. But you can just sort of see in the bottom photo on the wing that's a little bit higher up, you can see the barred wingtips. A nickname for short-eared owl has been ghost of the grasslands. And this is for two reasons. The first is their sort of overall pale color, as well as they have a really sort of graceful flight that I guess reminded people of ghosts. I'm not sure exactly why, but the flight pattern and the pale coloration gave them that nickname. You might be wondering about the name. Just like the horned lark, the short-eared owl, I mean, I guess it's a little bit more appropriate in this case because the ears are so short, the ears, which are feather tufts, are so short to the point where it's extremely hard to see them. So these feather tufts you can also see in things like great horned owls or long-eared owls. So short-eared owls have them, but they are so short you usually can't see them. And the name for these tufts is called flumicorns, which I just thought is that's a fun thing to know. But short-eared owls are considered special concern federally, and they are threatened in our province. So as you can see from this distribution map, short-eared owls can occur over quite a large portion of the province, but you don't have a particularly high chance of seeing them in any one place. So they can be basically all over the south and central areas of the province, and then their distribution also follows the Assiniboine River out to the west. They use grasslands or open bogs, fens, or marshes, and they can also nest in agricultural fields, although this is becoming increasingly rare due to the way we farm. Back when farms were more of a mix of, you might have livestock, you might have some crops, etc., it was more appropriate for them. But with the sort of lean towards monoculture cropping, it becomes less appropriate habitat for them. They usually like to have dense grass or shrub cover and also be slightly raised and dry. So for example, if they're in a bog, a fen, or a marsh, they want an area that's a little bit drier. And different to some owls, these guys hunt during the day. There are other owls that also hunt during the day. So for example, our burrowing owl as well. But it's a characteristic of these guys as well. Next, we have the upland sandpiper. So you might recognize sandpiper as being a species that's generally associated with shorebirds. So birds that you might find on the beaches of our lakes or in wetlands or in mud flats. The other part of its name, though, kind of contradicts that with the upland. So these are in the same family with other sandpipers, but they don't use that sort of wetland, marshy habitat, or at least not very often compared to other shorebirds. They prefer the upland, drier habitat. So being shorebirds, generally they can often have bigger body or be bigger bodied. So 170 grams would be the size for these guys. Beyond being a shorebird in grassland habitat, which makes them stand out quite a bit, they have a pretty unique body shape and silhouette. They have a tiny head and a long neck and a pretty big body. So that makes them stand out as well. Similar to the Sprague's pipit, they have a really big sort of eye to head ratio, at least it looks like that, which also makes them stand out quite a bit. Beyond that, they have a short yellowish bill. They have long yellow legs and a long tail. And these guys are both stand out quite a bit. They like to sit on things like fence posts and I guess have a look around, but they also stand out with the sound they make. It's a loud sound that sounds like a wolf whistle. So if you're ever out in the middle of nowhere and someone is wolf whistling at you, it's probably an upland sandpiper. Like I said, they are not associated with large wetlands or shorelines. Instead, they breed in native prairies and tame pastures in both areas with tall and short grasses. So there are kind of three sort of hubs of populations of these guys. We've got the one in southwestern Manitoba, where you can see the probability of occurrence is higher. But there's also another hub in the Interlake, as well as more towards southeastern Manitoba in areas that were historically tall grass prairie as well. They can persist in agricultural areas in low numbers where their habitat would be grassy road margins. And as I mentioned, they're often seen standing on fence posts as kind of the characteristic pose for the upland sandpiper. The last species I have for us to talk about today is the marbled godwit. And I've kind of used this as a placeholder species in a way because there's a whole range of birds that are prairie wetland birds that I'm not going to get into today. But the marbled godwit is just one example of that. So we think of prairies as just vast expanses of grass, but there's all kinds of potholes and other types of little wetlands and farmers' dugouts, etc., that provide habitat for these prairie wetland birds. So our marbled godwit example, they're quite large-bodied, 370 grams. You can see they have a very distinct bill. It is quite long and upturned. It's got a bit of a curve going up with a pinkish base. You can't see too well in this picture here because the water's a bit high, but they do have black legs. And if they were to raise their wing in order to stretch, or if they were going to take off to fly, you'd see that there's a strong cinnamon color underneath that contrasts with their body color. And then overall, they're kind of a buffy cinnamon color. There is another species of godwit called the Hudsonian godwit that looks quite similar to these guys, especially in the non-breeding plumage. But marbled godwit breed in southern Manitoba in the grassland area, whereas Hudsonian godwits migrate further north. So you only have to worry about that in the if you're there in the spring or fall migration with those two species overlapping. So the marbled godwit also have the sort of three areas of peak abundance. Once again, southwestern Manitoba, in the Interlake, and in the southeast. They nest in native grasslands, but they can also use human altered habitats like sewage lagoons, hay fields, even some cropland. And they can be found a considerable distance from water. So when we're doing grassland breeding bird surveys, you can walk across what looks like a field of mixed grass prairie, no water in sight, and these guys will be calling, trying to get you out of the way of where they might be breeding. So they can be associated with wetlands, but they also don't necessarily need to be. So that's it for the actual bird identification section. And I often get questions on where to bird, where are these areas of grassland? So I thought I'd go into that just a little bit as well. So of course, we're all here at the Living Prairie Museum presentation. So this is a spot in Winnipeg where you can breed, or you can bird. It's open to the public. It's got a walking trail, pretty easy to get to if you're in Winnipeg here. It is a smaller parcel of land for any kind of grassland birds. Generally, they need more space, but you can see a lot of the secondary grassland bird species in this habitat. Okamic Marsh also has an area of remnant tall grass prairie that's on the western side of the wildlife management area. So if you were to take the road that would take you into the interpretive center, but instead of turning into the interpretive center, you go a little bit further north, and then you go west and you go north again, following that same road, you'll eventually come upon the trail that goes through their remnant tall grass prairie. And if you were to go even further north, there's another good birding spot sort of along the mile roads there. That's a series, or a sod farm that has habitat, especially along migration. You can see some species there. Then of course, there's the area in southeastern Manitoba that also has remnant tall grass prairie. I believe this is all Nature Conservancy Canada, NCC property. But there are several trails in that area that have also remnant tall grass prairie. Once again, not fantastic for seeing primary prairie species, partly because the areas that we have left are so small, which is unfortunate, but great still for seeing secondary grassland or secondary prairie species. So now we're going to move into the mixed grass prairie habitat. So this one's got a long name, but this is the Ellis Archie Spy Hill Community Pasture Important Bird Area. So this is one of our IBAs. It is an active community pasture, so access is limited unless you talk to the pasture manager. There are areas to bird sort of around this. And that would be NCC, Nature Conservancy Canada's Fort Ellis properties. They have some unmarked trails there. So you can contact NCC Manitoba if you're interested in this. The other way to go about it is to bird on Highway 41 which passes through a bit of a center of Ellis Archie. It is a fairly busy road, so you just have to be careful while you're car birding. The Ellis Archie Spy Hill Community Pasture is partially in Saskatchewan and partially in Manitoba. And the reason why it is designated as an IBA is because it's our largest intact area of mixed grass prairie left in Manitoba, and also obviously a large portion in Saskatchewan. It's also probably has the highest concentration of breeding chestnut colored longspurs in Manitoba as well. So it's a really unique place. And this is, I should say, this is out near St. Lazare, would be the town that people would probably know best in this area. So next we have the Southwestern Mixed Grass Prairie IBA. And this is that little piece in the corner bordered by United States in the south and Saskatchewan on the west that showed up in all of the primary prairie species occurrence maps. So this is really the sort of heart of where we have Southwestern Mixed Grass Prairie. A lot of this area is privately owned land, but it's where we have the rest of our or the majority of the rest of our mixed grass prairie in Manitoba. So it's bordered by towns like Lyleton, Tilston, Pearson, Broomhill, and of course Melita is probably the biggest town in that area. A lot of birding that happens here would be car birding along the many back roads or mile roads. But if you're someone who would like to get out and walk a little bit, there's the Ralph Wang Trail, the Gainsborough Dam area, and Coulter Park give you some options to get out and walk. Also in this area, there's a sort of trail laid out called the Manitoba Grasslands Birding Trail, and there's a northern loop and a southern loop. So these are car driving loops that give you some sort of key areas you might want to stop and get out and bird at. I mean, of course, you can go off the trail as well. And there's also sort of interpretive signs at each of these little yellow circles that tell you something about the birds or the habitat. So if it's your first time in southwestern Manitoba, this can be an excellent resource to follow. And this was put together by the province of Manitoba. And you used to be able to get it at the Travel Manitoba building at the Forks. I'm not sure like what their status is, if they're open or not, but you can also find it online. So this can be a good guide. And then the last suggestions I have is another important bird area, and that's Oak Lake, Plum Lake. The IBA was primarily designated, as the name suggests, for the lakes, but there is remnant native grassland and also tame grassland near the areas of Pipestone, Hartney, and west of Oak Lake itself. And the quality of this habitat for grassland birds kind of changes depending on the year. So they've got more grassland in dry years. So for example, last year, 2021 summer, it was quite dry. So this area was pretty good for grassland birds. In wetter years, it's not as good for grassland birds, but then you've got the prairie wetlands, prairie potholes kind of situation that goes on, which is great for birding for another category of birds. Yeah, and the last thing I thought I'd touch on is when to bird. So the time of year matters. Breeding bird season is generally late May to early July, and that's when birds are vocal and displaying to attract mates and to protect their territory. Most of the birds I talked about today are migratory birds. So if you try to go out and see them too late in the fall, too early in the spring, or in the winter, of course, they're not going to be there. As well as the time of day is important. So if you are an early bird, a half hour before dawn to around 10:30 a.m. is generally the key time. Birds can be active after this, but it really depends on the weather. So the birds will hunker down in the heat of the day. As well, they won't be singing when it's raining, of course. They'll be more hidden, but also it'll be harder to hear and see them if it's windy. However, if it's in the summer and it's a cooler day, they'll be active more later into the day. So it really depends on the weather. And lastly, if you're getting into grassland birds, I thought I'd highlight a couple of grassland bird resources. So I already mentioned the Manitoba Grassland Birding Trail booklet. There's another similar booklet called the Manitoba Pine to Prairies Birding Trail that's more based in eastern Manitoba. So that's an option. It is quite similar to the Grassland Birding Trail in that it gives you a route and suggested locations that you can follow. If you're looking to start to identify grassland birds, the Manitoba IBA program has a grassland birds quick ID sheet that's available on our website, and we're also happy to send that out to people if they send us an email. And it's got your primary prairie species as well as a selection of the secondary prairie species, and it's sort of a laminated quick guide meant to be folded and be carried in a back pocket or something like that. And we also have a landowner's guide to grassland bird conservation in Manitoba. As I mentioned, we do quite a lot of outreach with landowners, cattle producers, et cetera, in southwestern Manitoba to try to raise awareness of grassland birds and how habitat can be beneficial to both their operations and grassland birds as well. But other people might find that interesting too. It's also available on our website. And another great resource is ebird.org. I'm not sure how familiar people are with this, but it's basically a citizen science website for people to report the birds they've seen. But you can also use it the other way around, where you can look to see what people have been seeing where and at what time, and then plan your birding trip accordingly. So that's a vast simplification. eBird has a lot of different options you can explore and maps you can look at, et cetera. But that's how it can be useful basically for planning your birding trip. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thanks so much for hosting me, and thanks everyone for listening in. And I'm happy to take questions, or yeah, if you'd like to contact me to get any kind of resources, or if you're interested in volunteering, we're always happy to hear from people.
Well, thank you very much. That was a phenomenal overview of some of these really interesting birds that we can see in our prairies. It's great to see this. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll just start reading through so that Amanda has an opportunity to answer. So I'm just going to scroll up here to make sure I'm catching everything. So it looks like our first question is from Colleen, and she's wondering, since we had a drought last summer, if the grasshopper sparrow expanded its range.
So I don't know in terms of hard data if this was the case. I did hear anecdotally from a number of people, and I had thought I experienced it myself, was that sort of in areas that were sort of around the periphery of the sort of the core grassland habitat, we did seem to be seeing more grassland grasshopper sparrows pop up, as well as some of the other prairie species. So I don't know that anybody's looked at it, looked at the data and compared it to past years specifically, but anecdotally, it did seem like prairie species were expanding their range in a dry year.
There's another question here about turkey vultures. Laura's just wondering if turkey vultures are considered grassland birds.
I don't know. I suppose you could consider them secondary prairie species, as you do see them in southwestern Manitoba, and they can use grassland habitat. They are a very widely distributed species. So for example, you can see turkey vultures in Winnipeg as well, in the city. So they do have quite a wide habitat. I wouldn't classify them as grassland birds specifically, but you definitely can see them in grassland areas. I've certainly written them down in grassland bird surveys while I've been doing monitoring.
Yeah, thank you. We actually were lucky enough to see one at Living Prairie Museum a few years back, because there was a deer carcass in the middle of the prairie, and it attracted a turkey vulture.
I was going to say fantastic, but I guess it depends on the point of view you're looking at. Fantastic for the turkey vultures.
There's another question here. What would make the horned lark raise its horn feathers?
I don't know about the horned lark specifically, but for a lot of birds, their crown feathers, so on top of their heads, they raise and lower those feathers generally when they're agitated. So horned larks, I imagine, are probably similar. So that might be if they're territorial and are trying to chase another bird off their territory, or if they're really like worked up and excited for some reason. That generally is when birds will sort of fluff up the feathers on the top of their head and try to be intimidating to the best that they can.
And there's a question here. Someone's wondering if there's any chance that the greater prairie chicken could be introduced back into Manitoba.
I don't know of any plans so far. I know that the provincial government, the people who work on species at risk, are always interested if there would be a stray greater prairie chicken that happened upon Manitoba. But as far as I know, there's no plans for an introduction. It's kind of monitoring does happen in the area where they were last seen, which is a little bit more to the southeast. So if any reports came in, I think they'd be very fast at going to investigate, but I don't know of any plans to reintroduce them.
Are there any grassland birds that you might be able to see in winter?
Off the top of my head, nothing that I can think of. I'm trying to think if there'd be any secondary prairie species that would be one of our, or any of our species that would stick around. There are some species, like for example, sharp-tailed grouse is considered a secondary prairie species, so that would be a species that would stick around. But it probably, there might be some more that I'm sort of just missing off the top of my head, but they would be secondary prairie species for sure. And it would probably be birds that you generally don't necessarily associate with prairies super strongly. They'd be more generalists.
Thank you. Are there any birds that you haven't been able to find or see that are sort of sneaky species for you that are difficult to locate?
Yeah, well, so I have a sort of unfair advantage in that I've done a couple years of specifically grassland bird monitoring in southwestern Manitoba. So I do have all of them on my list that I've been able to see. But in terms of species, burrowing owls. I've never seen a burrowing owl in the wild, so that would be one. And the other one that I've only seen once is Fruminous hawks. So that was really neat to see. They're very large, so it was a great experience.
Yeah, I think I'm still hoping that one day I'll see a burrowing owl in the wild.
I think that would be really high up on a lot of birders' lists.
And I'll just grab a couple more here. There's a question asking any chance of grassland restorations. I read this wrong. Any chance of grassland restoration to give prairie birds more habitat? So I guess are restorations effective at providing habitat for these grassland birds?
So I would say yes and no to some extent. Once prairie is dug up, you can't reestablish that habitat the way it was. So that's why it's so important to stop grassland habitat from being converted to begin with. As I mentioned, sort of going through the presentation, when I said species can use tame pasture land or species can use hayland, that's sort of the second best, and that can be, sometimes it's entirely tame species, so like introduced species. And sometimes it can be sort of habitat that has tried to be restored. But there are, once grassland habitat is dug up, the plants themselves take a long time to reestablish. They have really deep root systems that are hard to, or take a number of years to establish themselves. There are a lot of weedy, or we would consider them tame species that can establish much faster. So it's harder for them to it's harder for native species to compete. And it's expensive to try to restore large pieces of grassland. So unfortunately, I don't think we're ever going to get ourselves out of the problem of having lost so much grassland through restoration. It would be more of a technique to target in smaller areas. So still worthwhile, but in terms of the funding that I think a lot of conservation organizations have, it's not, unfortunately, it's not a realistic option to sort of gain back what we've lost.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the tough part with prairie conservation, eh?
Yeah.
So there's one last question here. I think a number of these species are ground nesters, but do any of the birds we've talked about use artificial nest boxes?
Yeah, so most grassland species are ground nesters, just because that's what's available in their habitat, and a couple here and there use trees, like for example, the Fergus hawks, although I think they can also nest on the ground. There are secondary grassland species that do use nest boxes. So mountain bluebirds and eastern bluebirds can be considered secondary grassland species. So they would be able to use nest boxes that people would put out, usually along the fence lines. Sometimes landowners will put out nest boxes for them. But I think those would be our only ones.
Okay, I think we'll leave it at that then. That was I really appreciate all those answers to those questions. We've got a lot of curious people here, and they're definitely sharing their appreciation in the chat right now for the great presentation and for all the information that you were able to share. So I'd just like to thank you very much for being here, for sharing your expertise. And we'd also like to thank everybody for participating, because your support helps keep the series going, as well as other initiatives that support prairie conservation and museum activities throughout the year. So we really do appreciate that. So just to let everyone know, the next winter speaker will be joining us on February 22nd, and we'll learn about modular prairie design using an ecosystem approach. So the link to register for that can be found on the Friends and Museum website. And for this talk, access to the recording will be made available to members once the video is ready to view. So that link will go around to members shortly. And I noticed that the contact information for Amanda was up on the screen there. So if you have any more questions for her, certainly send her an email. You can also Google the Important Bird Areas website for more information about what you heard here tonight. So again, Amanda, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. And I hope you have a great evening.